Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to finish up the eighth story behind the eighth song in Ballads, A Tinker's Dozen. And if you look under the comments section right below this post, I will post the song that the story tells, just for your enjoyment and my enjoyment too. Okay, so we'll get back to Froggy, or Frenchie, as the case may be. A minute passed before the great door opened to him. There, standing prettily in the open doors that allowed entrance to the two-story tall hallway, was the object of his affection, Miss Mousie. She was small and delicately made, and when she walked, she seemed to float over the ground. Today she wore pale blue slacks that complemented the soft slate of her expressionless eyes. She looked Frenchie up and down and smiled. "You're tall. And handsome, too," she said, with a knowing nod to herself. The frog took Miss Mousie by her little hand and led her down the hallway to the French doors at the back. He opened them and led her across a wide sweep of vibrantly green lawn, past decoratively trimmed trees that resembled poodles, to a little greenhouse with a white marble bench before it that seemed to have been patiently waiting for the two of them for a long time. A soft breeze tickled the leaves of the other trees that had been planted there, especially to shade part of the conservatory. Frenchie turned and sat himself on the little bench and pulled Miss Mousie to sit on his knee. He looked at her for a long minute, saw her answer in her eyes, and then asked, "Miss Mousie, will you marry me?" Miss Mousie thought for one long minute, looked Frenchie in the eye for another, and then answered, "Without my Uncle Rat's consent, I wouldn't marry William Howard Taft." Then she hopped off the frog's knee, took his hand, and hurried him back into the great house. The two rushed back through the French doors, past a startled butler, and then left, and then right, nearly knocking over the downstairs maid, where they stopped short in front of a pair of mahogany pocket doors. "This is my uncle's study, Frenchie," she said, as she slid the doors open. "I'll let you two talk alone." And she winked at the frog as she shoved him into the room and slid the doors closed behind him. Frenchie walked into the study. Mr. Rat sat behind a great mahogany desk surrounded on all sides by mahogany bookshelves that began at the floor and ended 12 feet higher in a mahogany coffer ceiling. The spines of all of the books were bound in goat's leather, dyed a rich maroon with expensive aniline dyes, with their titles embossed in gold. What was not wood or leather in the room was sterling. All but Mr. Rat. He was dressed for leisure, but he was all rat. Uncle Rat wore a royal purple velvet smoking jacket with wide black satin lapels and a patissementary frogs of golden braid, lavender silk pajamas, and a rakish purple fez tilted in a Dutch angle on his head. He was enjoying a La Flor de Cuba torpedo, which he waved in Frenchie's direction, inviting the frog in. Miss Mousie waited outside the closed doors of her uncle's study. She could hear the two voices inside conversing quietly until she heard a loud laugh, and her uncle shouted, "To think my niece would be a bride," and then she opened the doors and ran inside. Her Uncle Rat sat there, tears streaming down his chubby cheeks and his fat sides rippling with laughter. He held out his arms to her, and she ran to his embrace. He kissed her little cheek and then blurted out, "I must hurry downtown and buy you a wedding gown, dear Miss Mousie." And then he put his hands on her shoulders to move her back so that he could stand. Then he ran out of the study and up the stairs to his bedroom to change his clothes, yelling down to the happy couple, "You must plan your wedding, you two." In a few minutes, Uncle Rat was dressed and out the door, and the two intended sat and put their heads together. There might have been a kiss or two, or more, during the planning, but before Uncle Rat returned with the wedding dress, Frenchie and Miss Mousie had decided that the wedding supper would be out back by the hollow tree, and that the bride and groom and their guests would dine on imported delicacies, moustique frite au pois noir, fried mosquito in a black-eyed pea, just as Frenchie's parents had done on their wedding day. It wasn't long before the invitations were sent out and all of their friends and relations had accepted, and on the day of the wedding, in the style of the two families, the guests brought food and entertainment to the wedding supper. Under the hollow tree down yonder, the table had been placed, and even before the first guests arrived, a cuckoo and 3 magpies found the branches above the table and lent their voices to the celebration. The first guest was Miss Flying Moth, a showgirl famous for her flights of fancy upon the stage, who brought a fine white tablecloth and laid it out on the old wooden table. Then she set the table with the costly china and leaded crystal and gleaming silver that had been set aside for the wedding feast. When the table had been set, Miss Junie Bug placed an earthenware jug full with clean, cool water she had brought on the table as well. Mrs. Bug worked for Uncle Rat in an advisory capacity. She would never tell, so no one ever asked. Other guests arrived. Mrs. Cow walked to the center of the dance floor and waited for anyone to join her in a dance. No one did. They all knew that she had 4 left feet. Mr. Bumblebee, a flashy dresser whose boring stories droned on and on, spent his time sitting any misses that he could find on his knee until one, a little broken-backed flea, a tiny flea, worked the confidence game, talking the rubes out of their earnings so smoothly and softly that they hardly ever felt the bite of their loss, pulled him to his feet and danced him a jig that set the other guests to whooping and hollering and dancing along. Not all the guests behaved themselves, though. A little black tick came to the table, pushed back his bowler, tied a napkin around his neck, and ate and ate and ate and ate until some of the other guests felt ill simply looking at him. And then a big black snake slithered in and finished up all of the wedding cake, even before it had been cut, but no one was brave enough to tell him that he was wrong, or to mention that he should wipe the crumbs away from his mouth. But regardless of the behavior of the guests, the bride and the groom had eyes only for each other. They danced the waltz of Limerick and the four-handed reel, but before they were halfway through the harvest time jig, tragedy struck. An old gray cat came to the wedding feast without invitation, as all of his kind always did. He had a bone to pick with the rat family and chose his time to settle the affair when they would be least expecting it. He pounced on Uncle Rat and gutted the old patriarch as quickly and surely as if he had gobbled him down in one gulp. Then he turned and reached out with his sharp knife and took the bride from her groom, and with only a cat-sized belch when it was through, sent Miss Mousie to join her uncle. When the frog saw the hungry gleam in the cat's eyes, he made tracks toward the brook, taking a powder. But as he leapt over the bubbling water, with escape in sight, a squad of white uniformed policemen, ducks they were called, Froggy should have understood this canard, opened their bills and swallowed him up. But back at the mansion, though, there was one little piece of cornbread still sitting on a shelf. And if you want any more, you can sing it yourself.